Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Abby Lester, and I'm the director of the JDC Global Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar presented as part of the JDC Archives Fellowship Program. Before we start today's program, I'd like to share a few words about the archives. We hold the organizational history of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, also known as JDC or the Joint, which includes millions of documents, hundreds of thousands of photographs, hundreds of artifacts, as well as audio, video, and film recordings dating back to the founding of the organization. Given the role JDC has played in Jewish lives around the world since 1914, our archives reflect not only the history of the organization, but also the history of world Jewry in the 20th and 21st centuries. Operating out of both New York and Jerusalem, visiting scholars from around the world utilize our unique offerings for their research, as do publishers, journalists, genealogists, curators, and filmmakers. To support scholarly research in our collections, we also offer fellowships funded by generous donors. Today's webinar is organized under the Max and Cecil Stoyer Chesson JDC Archives Fellowship, which was established by a generous gift from Dr. Sorel and Lorraine Chesson to honor Sorel Chesson's parents. Sorel and Lorraine are supporters of JDC who have deep roots in the field of higher education and a long-time commitment to academic research and scholarship. I want to extend our sincere thanks to Sorel and Lorraine Chesson, who are joining us today for endowing this fellowship. Our speaker today, Naama Seri-Levi, is the recipient of the Max and Cecil Stoyer Chesson JDC Archives Fellowship for 2025. Dr. Seri-Levi is the editor-in-chief of Yad Vashem Publications. She received her PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her dissertation examined Polish Jewish refugees in the Soviet Union during World War II and the Holocaust, focusing on their transnational networks and the ways in which their wartime experiences shaped their post-war lives. Her current research examines the trajectories of Jewish refugees in the Soviet Union, using digital humanities tools to analyze and map refugee movements based on overlooked archival sources. Her research on the subject has appeared in several scholarly articles. Dr. Seri-Levi was acclaimed conference Saul Kagan postdoctoral fellow in advanced Shoah studies and held postdoctoral fellowships at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and Bar Ilan University. Dr. Seri-Levi will talk for about 40 minutes. We will then entertain questions. And please note that your microphones are muted and you can send questions via the Q&A function in Zoom during any time. Dr. Seri-Levi will now start her lecture.
Thank you for the warm welcome. I am very happy to be here today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my research with you today. During the Second World War and the Holocaust, hundreds of thousands of Polish Jews, together with other Jewish refugees from various regions and evacuees, were dispersed across the vast territories of the Soviet Union. From European Russia to Siberia, there was Central Asia and beyond. The wartime experiences were shaped by flight, deportation, hunger, and displacement, as well as by constant effort to be located, registered, and reached. This lecture focuses on one major effort to reach them, the Parcels operation organized by the JDC for Jewish refugees and evacuees in the Soviet Union during the war. I would examine how this relief operation emerged, how it functioned across wartime borders, and institutions, and how parcels of food, clothing, and other supplies were sent to people dispersed over an enormous territory. At the same time, I will ask what the records produced by this operation can tell us about the refugees themselves. In order to send parcels, the JDC and its partners had to compile lists of residents. These lists recorded names, locations, and addresses. They were created for practical and logistical purposes, but today they preserve something much larger, a documentary trace of Jewish refugees' trajectories in the Soviet Union and the war. The historical question, then, is how we can move from these administrative records to a fuller picture of wartime displacement. Even though a large number of Jews survived the war in the Soviet interior, still efforts to reconstruct this history in detail often encounter fragmented and uneven evidence. Historians frequently rely on testimonies, memoirs, letters, post-war collections, and institutional reports. These sources are indispensable. They preserve the personal voices, experiences, suffering, strategies of survival, and memory. At the same time, they often provide partial and localized perspectives. They allow us to reconstruct individual trajectories, fami- familiar or particular communities, but they do not always make it possible to see the broader geography of the displacement. This is where the JTA Parcels lists become especially valuable. They do not replace testimonies or memoirs. Rather, they add another layer of evidence. They allow us to place individual names within a wider landscape, to ask where refugees were located, how they were distributed across Soviet space, and which places became significant centers for Jewish refugees' life. The lecture will therefore move in three steps. I will begin with a brief historical background on the wanderings of Polish Jewish refugees in the Soviet Union. I will then describe the emergence of the JDC Parcels operation. Finally, I will turn to the lists themselves and show how transforming them into a structural dataset makes it possible to map the locations that appear in them. In doing so, I hope to show how seemingly routine bureaucratic records can help us recover the human landscape of Jewish refugees' life at the time and place. More than 200,000 Polish Jews, the largest group of Polish Jewish Holocaust survivors, survived the war by finding refuge within the Soviet Union. At the outbreak of the war, many Polish Jews fled eastward in an attempt to escape the advancing German army. Some fled on their own initiative, while others followed the Polish government's call for young men of military age to relocate eastward in preparation of the possible rebuilding of the Polish army. These movements began even before the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland on September 17, 1939. Following that invasion, and in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, many refugees from western Poland suddenly found themselves under Soviet rule. In the months that followed, additional families and individuals continued to move eastward, some in search of relatives who had remained there, and others in the hope that life under Soviet rule would be preferable to life under Nazi occupation. Many of those who fled east, later arrested and deported by Soviet authorities in 1940 and 1941. Some had refused Soviet citizenship or had requested permission to return to German occupied territory, actions that aroused Soviet suspicion, together with Jews from eastern Poland who were labeled politically or socially problematic. They were exiled deep into the Soviet interior, often to remote and harsh locations, including Arctic regions, gulag and labor camps in Siberia, and distant parts in Kazakhstan. A major turning point came after the German invasion of the Soviet held territories in June 1941. In July 1941, the Soviet government and the Polish government in exile concluded the Sikorski-Maisky Agreement. The arrangement restored diplomatic relations between the two governments, allowed Polish delegations to operate in the Soviet Union, facilitated aid to Polish citizens, and authorized the formation of Polish army on the Soviet territory, later known as the Anders Army. As part of this agreement, deported Polish citizens, including Polish Jews, received an amnesty in August 1941. Many were released and began moving southward, especially toward the southern republics of the Soviet Union. This movement was encouraged by several factors: distance from the battlefront, proximity to the Soviet border, the organization of the Polish army in the region, and Central Asia's reputation for relatively better food supplies and mildest climate than northern regions. At the same time, the Soviet evacuation of 1941 and 1942 relocated factories, industrial equipment, workers, and their families from areas near the front lines to the Soviet interior in order to prevent their capture by German forces. Millions of civilians, including government officials, intellectuals, and other vulnerable groups, were also moved eastward and southward. Jews sometimes joined this evacuation either formally as workers or dependent in organized transports, or informally as part of the border flight from the coming front. Some Polish Jews, especially those who had fled east at the beginning of the war or who lived in territories annexed to the Soviet Union and had acquired Soviet citizenship, were evacuated with Soviet population or fled independently. These different movements, flight deportation, release from exile, organized evacuation, and renewed flight from the front, created a vast and shifting geography of displacement. After the war, most evacuees returned to their original homes or resettled elsewhere within the Soviet Union. Polish Jews, however, were repatriated to Poland under post war repatriation agreements. Until then, they had remained dispersed across thousands of kilometers throughout the vast territory of the Soviet Union. Their status in the Soviet Union was often deeply ambiguous. They were neither prisoners nor entirely free, and they remained subject to a Soviet inspection, regulation, and surveillance. Their citizenship status was also a persistent point of contention between the Soviet authorities and the Polish government in exile, further complicating their already precarious situation. While many refugees succeeded in rebuilding aspects of their lives despite these circumstances, refugees' life in the Soviet Union was also marked by profound hardship. Some of the refugees married, had children, pursued education, worked in various professions, and adapted to the city, towns, and settlements in which they found themselves. At the same time, the influx of refugees and evacuees into different localities created severe difficulties. Prolonged displacement, exhausting journeys, overcrowding, poor housing conditions, food shortages, diseases, and epidemics all contributed to high mortality rates. This situation was described by many refugees, among them Jakub Rosenblum, originally from Krakow, who found a shelter in Samarkand, Uzbekistan. In a very early testimony, already in 1943, he said, "In the winter, a typhus epidemic broke out. Hospital beds ran out and sick were lying on the streets. And the epidemic spread so rapidly that in 1 month, 30,000 typhus cases were counted in Samarkand. People were buried en masse, and those who survived felt like candidates to become the next corpses." To this terrible situation, warfare efforts were established. Following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, new channels of communication and supply opened between the Soviet Union and the Allied forces. Among other developments, military equipment, medical supplies, food, and other forms of aid began entering the country on the unprecedented scale. Iran, and especially Tehran, became the principal base from which assistance was transferred into the Soviet Union throughout what became known as the Parcels Corridor. American, British, and Polish forces, in addition for civilian organizations, established a presence there and had created new possibilities for relief activities across the Soviet border. As part of the relief activities for the refugees, the Polish delegations and local representatives received packages of goods which were distributed to remote and isolated locations and provided financial aid. The JDC was one of the organizations which opened a headquarters in Tehran to send help for the refugees. After setting an office at the place, they began organizing shipment of parcels to refugees and evacuees inside the Soviet Union. Between October 1941 and January 1943, the JDC dispatched almost 3,400 cases, more than 1,100 packets, and 10 barrels. Most of these shipments consisted of medical supplies, hospital equipment, and matzos. Between April and June 1942, more than 3,000 cases of matzot were shipped from Philadelphia to the Soviet Union and distributed by Polish delegations to Polish Jewish refugees across vast territories, including Samarkand, Fergana, Koibyshev, now Samar, Tomsk, and Barnaul. Since the Soviet authorities refused to permit assistance explicitly designated for a sectarian population, which means targeted for Jews only, the JDC directed shipments to locations known to have substantial Jewish populations. In addition to these collective shipments, the JDC also began sending individual parcels containing food, clothing, and hygiene supplies. The individual parcels were intended especially for people who had no relatives or acquaintances that could help and finance parcels by themselves or other personal network unable to provide for them. For these recipients, the parcels were not merely symbolic gesture of hate. They could provide essential material support at time of severe shortage and hunger. The scale of the operation was substantial. Between December 1943 and December 1944, nearly 100,000 individual parcels were sent. This included more than 20,000 blankets, more than 20,000 kilograms of flour, almost 30,000 pairs of men's shoes, and almost 40,000 kilograms of tea. During 1945, approximately 91,000 additional parcels were dispatched. In total, between December 1st, 1943 and June 30, 1946, the JDC office in Tehran dispatched more than 211,000 parcels to the Soviet Union. The refugees used these products either for themselves or for trading in other products they were missing. This was a complex operation that depended on cooperation among several organizations, institutions, and countries. At the first step, money and recipients lists were sent from the United States to mandatory Palestine. From there, supplies were shipped with the help of Peltours, a tourist company well organized, to Iran. In Iran, the packages were packed, then transported into the Soviet Union. The involvement of multiple actors, Jewish organizations, Polish institutes, representatives in Tehran, and channels of communication with people inside and outside the Soviet Union illustrates how difficult it was to reach refugees scattered across such an enormous and political complicated territory. And so this operation also represents a form of contact with the outside Jewish world, an indication that someone knew of their existence, had recorded the name and address, and was attempting to reach them. The shipments were addressed to specific recipients whose names and location had been gathered through a broad and highly complex network. In order to reach refugees dispersed across the vast territories of the Soviet Union, the JDC first had to know who they were, where they were, and how they might be reached. The lists on which the operation depended were compiled from multiple sources. First, private people, such as relatives and friends in the United States, Canada, and Latin America, sent known details of their acquaintances in the Soviet Union. This practice was in use as a general effort of searching for missing relatives during the war, not only in the Soviet Union, but also in occupied territories. Second, addresses were taken out of cables and letters received from people inside the Soviet Union. David Koren was 5 years old boy in Kolbishova, Poland, at the outbreak of the war. He was deported with his family to Prem and then found their way to Kazakhstan. In a late testimony, he described that they had heard rumors about the JDC sending packages from Iran to Jews who contacted them. And so, as an elementary schoolboy, he wrote a postcard as a representative of several refugees' families, stating that there are Jews and hungry. Ask for their help. According to his testimony, after several weeks, they started to receive packages, and in his own words, that's how we survived war. However, most of the addresses and details, thousands in numbers, were received from a wide range of Jewish and relief organizations, including, among others, the Union of Russian Jews, the American Federation of Lithuanian Jews, Hadassah, the Union of Yiddish Writers, the World Movement of Mizrahi Pioneers and Labor in Mandatory Palestine, and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, HIAS. The multiple diverse organizations show how complicated the operation was. It required cooperation across continents, languages, political borders, institutional frameworks, and wartime communication channels. Each name on a list was therefore the result of a large process. Someone had to identify a person in need, transmit the information, reserve the address, and connect that individual to a relief system operating from Tehran and reaching deep into the Soviet interior. 80 years later, these lists are valuable not only as logistical records, but also as evidence of the networks through which Jewish refugees became visible to the outside world. The JDC archive contains several lists of parcel benefi- beneficiaries in the Soviet Union. The largest document comprises 73 typewriting lists of beneficiaries of the JDC parcel operation. In total, the lists include more than 6,300 entries. Each list contains between several dozen and 700 entries, each consisting of a name and an address. In some cases, the address is specified down to a building level, while in others it indicates only the name of a train station, which appears to have served as a practical collection point in more remote locations. The first dated list, list number 5, is from June 1943. The final list is dated November 1945. In addition, there are almost 700 supplementary entries recording changes in names and addresses for individuals listed previously. These updates, which appear at the end of the list rather than in separate documents, make it possible to track changes in recipients' location over time. The latter list notably recorded movements of refugees and evacuees from Central Asia and the Ural back to Western Soviet territories. For example, from Fergana in Uzbekistan to Lvov to Lviv in Ukraine, and from Kazan in the Tatar Republic to Riga in Latvia. Beyond their administrative function, the JDC parcel lists provide a unique dataset that allows historians to reconstruct the spatial distribution of Jewish refugees and evacuees across the Soviet Union during the war. They provide data on the spatial distribution, the geographic reach of the parcels distribution, and the existence of centers in which the operation was concentrated. However, as long as no technological means existed for extracting and processing this information, it was nearly impossible to make effective use of this rich corpus. Manually copying thousands of entries, many of which contained places named that no longer exist or have changed over time due to geopolitical transformations, was a highly specialized and labor initiative process, requiring weeks of work or a dedicated team to transcribe the data and subsequently verifying it for accuracy. Identify the contemporary names and locations of which these places further demanded collaboration with specialists from various regions of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. The quantitative turn, together with the introduction of computational and AI-based tools, had made such effort significantly more feasible and accessible to scholars and enable scholars use type of sources which were usually neglected by now. To demonstrate this methodological development within the context of rich corpus of the list of addresses of the parcel operation, I will analyze two lists, list number 15 and list number 16, both dated December 1943, in the midst of the war. These lists serve as a representative sample through which the structure of the data, the geographic distribution of recipients, and the logic of parcel location can be examined in detail. The first stage was to prepare the archival material for structured analysis. OCR, which means optical character recognition, is a technology that uses automated data extraction to quickly convert images of text into a machine-readable format. In this case, as many other JDC archive materials, the lists were already digitized in an OCR format. I uploaded the PDF pages into ChatGPT in small batches and asked the model to extract the entries into an Excel spreadsheet structured according to several categories: page number, list number, serial number, last name, first name, regions, city, current name, country, address, coordinates, and comments explaining how ChatGPT identified or located each place. This structured schema ensured consistency across the dataset and enabled subsequent quantitative and spatial analysis. Coordinates were assigned to the center of each settlement. When a settlement could not be identified with confidence, I used coordinates for the geographical center of the relevant region, which was always specified in the source. The comment field was especially important because it made it possible to review the reasoning behind each geographical identification and to assess whether it was plausible. This process also required methodological caution. AI tools cannot be relied upon uncritically, either for transcription or for the identification of places' names, especially when dealing with remote regions, historical toponyms, inconsistent spelling, multilingual variants, or geopolitical name changes. The historian must therefore verify the data entry by entry, checking both the transcription and the reliability of the geographical interpretation. In this sense, AI does not, and I'm saying again, does not replace historical method. It accelerates specific stages of the workflow, transcription, extraction, and preliminary parsing, and thereby make it possible to work with large administrative sources that would otherwise be neglected. Reviewing and correcting an automated extraction is far more efficient than copying thousands of entries manually, but the analytical responsibility remains with the historians. During the review process, I manually added two variables: the number of individuals associated with each parcels, since several beneficiaries were often recorded under a single package, and the data associated with each entry. These variables made it possible to reconstruct distribution patterns more precisely and to analyze changes over time. The next stage was to standardize the dataset. Place names had to be made consistent across the table, and coordinates had to remain uniform for identical locations. For this purpose, I imported the Excel file into OpenRefine, a free open source tool for cleaning and standardizing data. This step was essential because the entries contained multiple variants of the same place name, as well as transcription errors introduced during the initial transfer. OpenRefine also enabled cross-filtering and faceted querying. For example, it made it possible to identify how many parcels were sent to Tashkent or Moscow, how many were addressed to single recipients rather than several individuals, and how such distribution changed cross lists. This is particularly useful for tracking updated addresses, especially as territories in Eastern Europe were liberated and recipients moved or were registered elsewhere. In this way, the database does not remain a static inventory of names. It can become a tool for following changes in residence status and access to aid over time. Within the broader development of computational methodological in the historical discipline, the integration of geographical information system, GIS, with big data approaches has substantially expanded the analytical capacities available to historians. GIS is a computer-based framework designed to capture, store, manage, analyze, and visualize data linked to specific location on the Earth's surface. By integrating spatial coordinates with descriptive attributes, GIS make it possible to examine not only the geographic distribution of a phenomenon, but also the relationships among them. It enables the construction of migration trajectories, the examination of settlement patterns, and the mapping of institutional and social networks. And so, List 15 and List 16 contains 339 numbered entries from 1615 to 1947, along with 7 additional updates to names and addresses already recorded in earlier lists. The geographic distribution extends across several Soviet republics, 167 beneficiaries in the Russian Republic, 114 in the Uzbek Republic, 38 in the Kazakh Republic, 9 in the Kyrgyz Republic, and 7 in the Tajik Republic, and 1 in the Georgian Republic. Although this is only a small sample, it reflects the broad dispersion of Jewish refugees and evacuees across the Soviet Union during the war. The map, based on this list, shows the remarkable geographical reach of the Parcels operation. Each location is represented by an equally sized dot, producing a clear visualization of spatial distribution rather than of numerical weight. The operation extended from St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, in the west to Yakutsk in the far east, almost 4,900 kilometers away, and from Usport on the Yenisei River in northern Siberia to Bukhta in southern Tajikistan, then Kurgan Tube. This map illustrates not only the spatial distribution of the locations, but also their geographical characteristics. Many of these settlements, whether in the European regions west of the Ural Mountains or in the Asian territories of the Russian Republic east to them, as well as in northern areas or near the border with Kazakh Republic, was situated along major rivers or at river ports. This pattern suggests that refugees and evacuees often resided in transformation centers or in locations selected for evacuation because they afford relatively favorable conditions for the relocation of industries and the movements of large populations. At the same time, this distribution may also shed light on the logistics of the parcels operation, potentially indicating that river and transport networks played a role in the shipment and delivery of aid of these dispersed recipients. Another useful function of GIS is the ability to examine the density and concentration of refugees and evacuees through the heat map. In this visualization, the lighter or more yellow an area appears, the higher the concentration of record settlements. The lighter blue areas, by contrast, indicate a more dispersed or separate distribution. The heat map presented here reveals a major concentration in eastern Uzbekistan and in areas close to Kazakhstan, as well as 2 additional clusters further north in the Russian Republic. Using a facade function at the OpenRefine on the dataset according to the current name category of the city reveals 7 principal locations of beneficiaries in the 2 lists. 3 of these were situated in the Uzbek Republic in Central Asia, 47 in Tashkent, 20 in Samarkand, and 7 in Bukhara. The remaining 4 were located in the Russian Republic, 12 in Klimesh and 9 in Melemish, both in Kirov Oblast, near the Volga River, 8 in Kuibyshev, now Samara, and 9 in Moscow. The presence of Kuibyshev and Moscow is especially significant. Although the lists are catalogued in the JDC archives under Polish refugees in Russia lists within the series of Relief Supplies Polish refugees in Russia, the special evidence suggested that beneficiary population was not limited to Polish refugees. Kuibyshev was a major destination for evacuated Soviet governmental institutions and wartime administrative structures. Moscow, by contrast, was a center from which evacuees were organized, while many residents and essential services remained there during the war. The concentration in Central Asian cities fits the Polish refugee context after 1941 amnesty and the southward movement of refugees. Yet, the Russian locations complicate this picture and suggested that the JDC internal distinction between the 2 archival series, Polish refugees in Russia and Jews in Russia, non-Polish, does not map precisely onto the geography of the lists. Building on this observation, it is also noteworthy that several recipients' names recorded in location within the Russian Republic appear in the Russian patronym form. For example, These two entries, both listed in Moscow, reflect a formal naming convention in which the patronym forms an integral part of personal identification. It can be suggested that at least some beneficiaries were integrated into Soviet frameworks rather than belonging exclusively to the category of Polish refugees. The addresses themselves provide another level of analysis. Some are specified down to a building level, while others refer only to a central office, railway station, or post office. About 35 entries use the poste restante, meaning that the parcel was to remain at the post office until collected by the recipient. This arrangement was typically used by people without a permanent address. Other entries identify artels, kolkhozes, hospitals, including NKVD hospitals, or workplaces such as lumber and forestry and enterprises. Some kolkhozes are identified by name, while others are by number, while others are named, such as Kolkhol Karl Marx in Kshil Rodinskaya Oblast of the Kazakh Republic, or Kolkhoz No. 20 in Marx, a city in Russian Republic. Several entries also indicate recipients living in the homes of other refugees, marked as CO, meaning care of, followed by the name of the primary resident. In this case, the list sometimes records a small cluster of connected households rather than isolated individuals. Because many of the addresses are specified at a street level, it is possible to identify potential centers of refugees residence by focusing on such entries. For example, in Kuibyshev, now Samara, a major evacuation destination during the war, 6 individuals are recorded residing at Sadovaya Street 188, a central street in the city where the large synagogue is located. Other analytical approach is to focus on a single city and examine the internal distribution of addresses. In Tashkent, for instance, the 47 parcels sent to recipients in the city, nearly all are associated with specific house addresses. This makes it possible to reconstruct the internal distribution of refugees at the urban scale and in later stage to place these addresses on a historical map of Tashkent. The possibilities I presented here are only a beginning. They show how digital tools can broaden the historical study of the Jewish refugees in the Soviet Union and the JDC Parcels operation that tried to reach them. But more importantly, they show how administrative records can be transformed into historical evidence of human lives. Behind every entry in this list stood a person or a family, displaced, hungry, often without a permanent address, and yet still visible to someone beyond the Soviet border. The parcels operation was therefore not only a mechanism of material relief, it was also a system of recognition. It recorded names, located people in space, and created a fragile line of connection between refugees scattered across the Soviet interior and the wider Jewish world. By mapping these records, we do not only reconstruct the geography of aid, we recover, however, partially the geography of survival. We can see where refugees were, how they moved, how they clustered, how they remained connected under conditions of war, hunger, and displacement. In this sense, the map does more than show where aid was sent. It allows us to see survival itself as special, social, and deeply human history. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fascinating. I appreciate it. We're going to open up to some questions now. Just a reminder again that your microphones are turned off, and we're taking questions via the Q&A function. We do have a number of questions already, and interestingly, there are a few that touch on the same question, same issue. How were supplies confirmed they got to the correct people in Russia? And another way of looking at that, how many packages were actually received by the intended recipients, or not stolen or confiscated by others or the Soviet authorities?
Okay, so these are both great questions. I'm not sure that I really have the answers for them. So there are some testimonies that are talking about the JDC parcel, not only those that I already mentioned, but people did receive the packages. I'm not sure if there are numbers. I mean, I haven't found at the archive any numbers of how many. I don't know if there were any um, offices that could make that kind uh, of of checking, because there was no JDC office inside the Soviet Union. Not only that, it was a really wide territory. Soviet Union, yeah, it's like a huge territory, but there was no one that actually could receive that kind of information and collect it. So this question a really good question, and I hope that I will get to know the answer for that.
All right. Do you have evidence for the interaction of displaced Polish Jews with Jews who lived in the Soviet Union since the Russian Revolution?
Yes, both in the north and in Central Asia, and then also evidence that there was something like a two-way relationship. The evidence that a testimony that are talking about how the Russian Jews were very happy to see those who came from Poland because they speak Yiddish, a language that they couldn't really speak, or that they couldn't teach their kids, and they were very happy that the Poles came. On the other side, the Polish Jews were happy of the Soviet Jews that could make an effort and try to explain what is the Soviet Union, what are the rules, what should be do, what they shouldn't do. Um, at Central Asia, it was more complicated because it was kind of different atmosphere. The Bukharian Jews, they were not Ashkenazi Jews. So it was more complicated because it was another kind of Jewish existence that many of them never heard about. But after the war, when the Poles came back to Poland after the repatriation agreements, many came back with their family. They got married to local Jews, including Russian Jews and Bukharian Jews. So there were people that, well, make the gaps in smaller and find their family there, even though there were differences between all kinds of groups of Jews.
Um, so, looking for one question. There are actually a number of questions. I'm just trying to find. There we go. Since you talked a lot about Tashkent, can you describe what life was like there at that time?
In Tashkent specifically.
Mhm. Yeah.
So in Tashkent, there were many universities and cultural life of evacuees. I mean, Russian evacuees, including Jews and non-Jews. So there are testimonies that many of the Jewish refugees, Polish Jewish refugees who came to Tashkent, in contrast to Samarkand, for example, were like more of the intelligentsia of those people. And Samarkand, the people there were more like in a tourist place. It wasn't, well, there were cultural activities in both places, but in Tashkent it was more in the governmental level than other places. But in Tashkent, as well in other places in Central Asia, the life were also like in a mixed status. In a way, they went to university, those who could, and they married, and some had also um, raised families there, but also in Tashkent, there are very bad conditions. There are high mortality, high epidemic rates. So it also all over the Central Asia, it was a mixture of the status.
Okay. Somewhat of a specific question. What was the relationship between JDC and Pelt Tours? How did that come to be a conduit from the U.S. to Iran for transshipment to the USSR?
So the Parcels was the Mandatory Palestine tourist organization. They were already they made a lot of tours between the Middle East and Iran and other places in the Middle East, far places in the Middle East. And so the Jewish agency with the JDC started to operate a cooperation with Pelters. It is very, very hard to find archival materials on Pelters. I tried a lot. The As I showed in the presentation, there are photos that show the signature of the Pelters. But somehow, at the JDC archives and also in the Jewish Embassy archives and the Zionist archive, the Pelters are hardly mentioned. I mean, you can find forms with the logos with that you need to write who are the recipients of this package. But it is very hard to find any correspondences between JDC and Pelters people and the Jewish agency and the Pelters people. But because we have the forms and we have the forms and the photos, we know that they were a very important figure in this operation.
Interesting. How was the location of the refugees communicated with JDC during World War II and the arrangement of the supplies coordinated?
How was the communication? Like the
Yes,
postcards from
where they
the
needed to
Soviet Union.
go. Right, exactly.
Okay, so even though it's hard to believe, there was coastal correspondences between the Soviet Union and Iran and through Iran to other places in the free world. It's already immediately after the Nazi invasion that it was organized, and there was connections between, I mean, from Iran, supplies came into the Soviet Union, including ambulances and ammunition and so on. And on the other side, post came out. I mean, so many testimonies, oral testimonies, already testimonies from the 40s, all talk about, the many of them talk about how they could reach their relatives in the US, in Argentina, in mandatory Palestine through Iran. And we have envelopes with the stamp. You can see stamps from the Soviet Union and then in Iran and then in Egypt and so on. You can see the entire route of the letter. Still, it is very hard to understand what exactly was the mechanism of the operation within Soviet Union, because it's not very clear how after it crossed the borders, what happened. So in the first step, when it was through the Polish delegations, so it was very easy because you have a center. You send it to the Polish delegation, which was very organized. They had a lot of sources. They could get money and equipment for schools, for example. So you have a center, and from there people could come and take the packages. But the individual packages, it was not through the Polish delegation. It is very hard to track how exactly it worked. We don't have enough information. It's a work in progress. So still need to dig more in the archives for reports and protocols and so on. But even though I read so many things about it, I mean, secondary sources and archival material, no one can actually say how it really worked. What was the mechanism?
Interesting. So that sort of a follow-up question, were the addresses where people lived, or was it a central place? And you kind of just talked about that, that there.
When it was no, it was for a specific address and specific. Sometimes it talked about specific um, house in one building. I mean, floor number 2, door number 5. So it depends on what it was, and sometimes it's what entirely just a name of a train station. So it's very depends on how remote it was of the places, how remote they were.
Got it. Um, let's see. Uh, uh, Going back to something you spoke about during your presentation, um, can you repeat which city Sadkovskaya Street was in? and if the synagogue that was
Yeah.
there is still there.
Yes, it's still there. It transformed. A lot of things happened to the synagogue during the years, but it's still there. It's still in the
Hmm.
same place. Just Koibishev. Now it's Samara. At the time, it was Koibishev,
Tomorrow.
but it's like the central administration city after the evacuation, where all the delegations and embassies were.
Got it.
It was the main place at the time.
Okay. Um, I'm seeing if I can combine some. I'm not so sure. Let's see. Um, can you talk a little bit more about your process of collecting the data? And you collected it from the JDC archives. Were there other places that you collected it from?
No, it's a big collection of more. It's almost 350 pages of lots of names. So it's one corpus. There are some other equivalent corpuses about the refugees and about evacuees. It's a former Soviet sources, but as for the packages, I also looked at the Zionist archives, Central Zionist Archive, and I couldn't find such lists. So it's the JDC that I think, as far as I found, um, save most of these kinds of records.
Hmm. Good to know. There have been a number of comments and questions about people asking if they can access these lists, and yeah, they're all in our database on our website. I will mention a we also have a separate database of names that is more genealogical research
Mhm.
for genealogical research that is not part of our overall digital collections, and that we are rebuilding, and it should be launching. Our names database should be launching again in a nice, easy format to search in the next few weeks. So keep an eye out for that. But these lists also aren't necessarily all in that database; they're also within our collections. As far as, am I right? You probably know more about that part than I do.
Well, I think it's very, for me, it was very much more easy to see all the names in one place, not just look for a name, because sometimes you need to know when it comes to genealogical sources, you have to know the name of the
Yep.
person that you are looking for. But
Right.
I am doing the opposite way.
Yep. Yep. Got it. Let's see. I have a couple more. Uh, some very specific questions. Let's see. Did you investigate the Polish Jews who were deported to labor camps in Chelyabinsk, where a tank factory was located?
Not specifically,
Okay.
but in the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years, the research and the scholarly efforts about to s- to know what were the lives of the Polish Jewish refugees became much more, um, it's a worldwide effort. There are some monographs about that and lots of articles, so it's out there in the internet.
Great.
Maybe the one who asks can look it for in one of the articles in monographs.
Okay. We're also going to share the questions with you, and so if there's more that you can share afterwards, and you can respond to people directly. Do you have any publications that describe your work so far?
Um, I have some articles about the Polish Jewish refugees at the end of the war and immediately after the war. I have several articles about the quantitative turn about and how we can use digital tools to analyze the patterns of displacement of the refugees, but um, it's on the queue. So I'm waiting for the publications. I don't know when it will be published, but it's on the way.
Okay, great. Um, do you have lists or data from the Polish delegations or the Soviets?
Lists of names.
It
or
seems like that
protocol?
lists, I believe lists, I would think this means lists of names. It doesn't
Oh,
specify.
I haven't looked for those kinds of
Okay.
lists. Maybe they're at the archives in Warsaw, but there's a very important protocol of the Polish embassy. They started to write it in Kuibyshev, but they published it already in Tehran in August 1943, and it's a very important protocol because it is all it talks only about the Polish Jewish refugees. So it's a long protocol that talks only about the Jews.
Mm,
Sometimes it combines them with the non-Jews, but it's very important because it's saying how many Jewish refugees lived in any of the areas in the Soviet Union. Sometimes specified to areas alone, sometimes to a city level. But it's very very interesting to know how it also talk about the percentage of Jewish refugees within the total Polish refugees population. So it's very important.
okay.
So it's very and you can find it. It's already digitized in several libraries. So maybe you can reach it from home.
Excellent. Okay, so we're going to stop there. There are definitely questions that I know the archives has answered in the back end that relate specifically to our collections, but I think there'll be other questions that we'll share with you that you can respond to people directly afterwards. And I want to thank you for this really interesting presentation and discussion. Um, and thank everybody who joined us today. We're taking a small break for the remainder of the summer. So our next program will be on September 8th with Dr. Emmanuel Moskovitz, probably somebody you know. um, so please sign up for our e-newsletter if you would like to be added to our mailing list for public programs. Um, and while we're taking a little break, also feel free to look on our website for recorded programs that you may have missed. And thank you for joining us and have a good rest of your day or evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.